Well, hello everyone and welcome. Thanks for watching. I'm Alex Bean. I'm a contributor to the music site 360degreesound.com where we bring you music from all angles. For this installment of our long-running Author Talk series, I'm joined by Cleveland-based music journalist Annie Zaleski, author of the new book on Cher, I've Got You Babe, A Celebration of Cher. And Annie, this is a fantastic read. I absolutely adored it, and I'm so pleased to talk with you today. One thing that you start your introduction with, you talk about different generations because Cher is one of those few stars that encompasses
Yeah.
multiple generations. At what point did you connect with her? Because for every generation, it's different. Where was
Mm.
your first connection point with Cher?
If I have to think, I think it was my connection point with Cher was the late 80s. And I guess mid to late 80s, because I think, her star as her reputation as a movie star was so high at that point. And she was also really, her music career was really taking off again. She was a rock star again in the late 80s, early 90s. And so definitely vivid memories there. And then when Believe came out in the late 90s again, that was another resurgence for me. I was in college at the time and like Believe you just could not get away from. So I think both of those eras were what really, kind of, were my Cher highlights to date before doing this book, I would say.
Absolutely, absolutely. And when you think about those different connection points, what do you think is the key to her success in terms of longevity? Because to your point, she's really kind of rode different music waves over the years. But we know other artists who have, and they haven't had the longevity. So where is her kind of, or secret to success, so to speak?
I think part of it is that she's always willing to pivot. Cher, if something is not working, she was always thinking of a plan B or a plan C and is not afraid to try something new as well. If she's looking for a new direction. She's also uncommonly resilient. I mean, I think so many of us, when we go through things, failures or we face with obstacles, sometimes it can be really kind of hard to try to find a way around it and hard to figure out what do we do next? Can get very, you can get very depressed. You can get very, just feel discouraged. And she is just unbelievable in terms of, nope, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep going for, whether it's for her family or creativity. She is just, when you look at her career, there have just been so many times where she's had to kind of pick herself up, figure out what she's going to do and then just do it. And I think she's never, afraid also to kind of dig in and, kind of in a DIY fashion, do her own thing. She's never, especially in, the late 70s when she was trying to pick her career back up as a solo artist, she went to Las Vegas as an example. In the 90s when she sort of had kind of some down periods, she had this amazing catalog. She did workout tapes. So, she really kind of found a way to kind of keep herself going, in unexpected ways and did it like that.
I think you bring up a great point. Very early in her career, of course, pretty much everybody knows the story of her and Sonny and the falling out.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of people don't know though that was also very financial and how
Yes.
that it happened. And he was, as you well document in the book, she found out that the majority of the money not only had he taken, but he had also spent it already. He was using it behind her. How do you think, to your point with her moving over her career, how do you think that changed her psychology moving forward?
I mean, it's a good question, because I think if you look at Cher, growing up, she's been very open about the fact that, she also didn't have a lot of money growing up, that her mom was a single mom and trying to raise Cher and her sister and, really, sacrificed to make ends meet. So I think Cher was used to really kind of being scrappy. And I think Cher was used to being like, okay, I'm going to try to figure out what I need to do to get by. So, I think with Sonny especially though, there was, as you mentioned, there was also business dealings. She found out after, the couple split that she was almost beholden to him in the business sense. And so I think from then on forward, I think she reconfigured her career to be a little bit more in charge of the business end and just to be a little bit more aware of, okay, this is what I need to be doing. I think when you see that in the fact that she has so many things on the side doing business, she has side hustles, she has things that she's doing. So I think it really kind of, reinforced to her that she, look inward and to also figure out and take care of herself and make sure that she's taking care of herself and later on when she had kids, take care of her kids as well.
One thing that I think you do very brilliantly in this book is those of us who love her music history, her catalog, you do a lot of coverage on her career in entertainment. To your point, she's pivoted over the years. She's done exercise, she's done films. Of course, she's an Oscar-winning actor. Um, it seems to me she's uniquely positioned as someone who really formed the basis for the modern pop star. And
Mhm.
as you were writing this, how much of that did you feel like as you're going through it saying, wow, a lot of our celebrities today that are expected to have the 360 deal, she's the originator.
I'm really glad you mentioned that and picked up on that because I completely agree. When she, you're right. Like right now, when you look at modern pop stars, they're expected to have, not just a music career, but also, maybe they're doing some acting on the side. Obviously, they have their touring business. Maybe they're doing some brand deals. Maybe they have another business on the side, So they're really sort of insulating themselves, from failure. And they're also really building their own business and their own brand. And you're right, she was the originator of that. When you kind of, and I don't think she gets enough credit for that in terms of for being sort of, long before there were influencers, long before there were people who were thinking like this, she always had things going on. She was always had her, this never panned out, but in the late 70s, she loved roller skating so much. She apparently bought a building and was going to start her own roller rink, so she was always thinking about other things to do and channeling her passions for it as well. And I think that's what also, kind of separates her is that when you look at everything she's doing, it's stuff that she can get behind. She's not necessarily, doing it, oh, because, I think that she would probably say in the 90s, yeah, maybe I did some things just for the money. But, for example, workout, tapes, she always works out. She still works out. It's not like it was out of the ordinary that she was just, kind of throwing her hat in the ring. This is something she's always been passionate about. You look at her gelato business, Gelato, which is first brilliantly named, but also just something I think she enjoys. So it's also stuff that really fits her brand. And I think that also, is something that maybe she doesn't get credit for, is that she really had her Cher brand very early on and really lived up to it and just really reinforced everything about it.
Is it, of course, and you talk a lot about her acting career. And as we said
Hmm.
earlier, she is an Oscar-winning actress. Um, you talk a little bit about this, about how she chose her projects. Where do you think she went wrong that a lot of her peers didn't get that? Because that's a very noteworthy transition. And I think maybe outside of Lady Gaga, who's gotten some nominations,
Hmm.
very few other stars have gotten that level of prominence. Where do you owe a lot of that pivot to?
So I think, the thing about Cher is that she, I think, made a lot of mistakes along the way. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. People sometimes forget that she spent so much of the 70s on TV with Sonny. She was, doing variety shows. She was doing her own specials. And so she really kind of honed her chops. She basically had a decade, more than a decade of being a working actress, maybe not necessarily in, a serious sense, like some of the roles she took in the 80s, but she really had the chance to kind of hone her stage presence, hone her timing, and as well being in Vegas, doing these very theatrical shows. She really had a sense to, get her timing down as a performer as well. So, she just didn't start doing, movies and say, oh, this is my first movie. She also did some stuff in the late 60s that are, a little bit obscure now, but I think that also that weren't very much a success. So she had a lot of failure before she was able to find success. And I think that's what's important too is that, she really had a chance, she had her flops before she was able to really find her success stories. And, the fact that she chose projects that she was passionate about. When you look at, she's been, especially in the last, I guess, 30 years or so, she's been very selective. If she doesn't want to do a project, she's not going to do it. And so she's definitely doing things that she's passionate about. I think about Mask, which is such a wonderful story. And, obviously they had Cher in mind for the role, but she really threw herself into it and was really very sensitive and empathetic. So I think that's also very true, is that Cher is also, because she's an empathetic person, she brings that to her acting as well. And I think that also makes a lot of difference.
You talked earlier about Believe, which I think for anybody who was growing up at any point in the 90s, I was in middle school in the 90s. I remember it. It was an anthem during that time. Um, do you get the feeling? I know you talk about the development of that song and the success of it.
Mhm.
Is that really kind of the boom of the second half of her career, do you feel like? Because it feels like for a certain generation, if that song has not happened, it's not to say Cher wouldn't be known, but it feels
Mhm.
like that really introduced her to a completely new demographic.
I would agree with that. I think that you probably get a little bit of, exennials, a little bit of kind of younger Gen X, and also millennials at that time. And so I think that really, because first off, the song, besides being a great song, also sounded very of its time. If you were a young kid, it sounded kind of funny. It sounded kind of like, what is this going on? And Cher was this like magical person basically within this. So I think that definitely you can say it's like pre and post Believe because after Believe, she just had a lot of opportunities coming her way. Not just musically, you had things like Will and Grace, where she was, a guest star and a kind of a recurring motif on there. She had some of her bigger, movie, appearances, whether it's Burlesque or Mamma Mia. And so I think that it did really kind of give her a boost and sort of remind people about the fact that, she is, a relevant musical artist. And I remember at the time, so many of the headlines were about her age and how she was at a certain age and she was getting this number one hit. And it was so unheard of at the time for a woman of her age to have this number one single and this success. And I think that was also another example of Cher proving everyone, that age is just a number and that I'm going to be a success anyway. But it really did kind of help her kind of bridge generations. And, I think really, kickstart her career because her dance music, she'd obviously always done dance music. She had a disco period, but I think especially after that, she really became more of a dance floor diva and really kind of leaned into that as well. And that also kind of opened doors for her.
Do you think that's also, I've noticed that as well when you think of like Burlesque or Mamma Mia too, she's leaning into kind of that camp culture
Hmm.
because I mean it's obviously not to say she has a very widespread female fan base and heterosexual male, but I would assume a lot of times you see the demographics. She's got a huge LGBTQ following.
Yeah.
Do you think that's also something that's really kind of stabilized her in this later run, whereas other artists kind of fall off later in their career and just kind of like Tina Turner go off into the sunset?
Yes,
Yeah.
100%. And, and I think it's because Cher has always really kind of leaned into, and affirmed her gay fans. When you look at her, I was very interested when I was kind of doing research on her early tours in late 70s, early 80s. She had drag queens in her shows then. And granted, she was in Las Vegas, so it fit, but I don't think there were many pop stars at that time really leaning into that. And so, and the camp element too, even when you look at some of her 70s stuff, especially some of her variety shows, it's so over the top. It's just the comedy is just so ridiculous. And so I think absolutely, I think she is one of those gay icons that is just, she is just untouchable because she has, she leans into it and she honors that too, and she recognizes that and she really values her fans. And that's always come through as well. And so I think that's also really helped.
Going along with that, we've praised her for this whole interview, but I would also say, obviously, you talk about later in her career, her social media, which is it's a
Yes.
lot. It's a lot. Um, I mean, what are your takeaways from that? Because I don't know if it's enough to say that it's villainized her to certain people as much as it is a curiosity after reviewing everything that she said and some of the more prominent things, what was your general feel for it? Has it really hurt her legacy or really influenced in another way? Are we making too much of it?
I think especially when Twitter was a thing and she was posting a lot on Twitter, I think in one sense it was a curiosity because it was absolutely her posting. So when you're talking about, talking to a superstar, everyone knew if they tweeted at Cher, like she would be responding. I think it really showed kind of her unfiltered nature. I think, when you so many musicians and so many superstars, when you look at their social media, you can tell that there's a team vetting things. The messaging that goes out is very manicured and very polished. And Cher was very much herself. She was very much Cher. And she definitely put her foot in her mouth, politically. She was very forthright about what she believed in. And, I don't think it necessarily villainized her. I think it humanized her and really made people be like, okay, Cher, I think Cher's always been known as someone who, has never put on airs and has always really been true to herself and said what she felt. And I think Twitter was sort of the embodiment of that. I think the final form of that. But I think, but it's hard, I think, but also, it brought out, when she was talking about her mom being sick, I think about that as well. A lot of people really related to her, and she talked about Kavan the elephant so much as well. So, she really brought a lot of like her whole self kind of the medium, which not a lot of musicians do. A lot of musicians want to hold things back and things like that. And she just wasn't, it's fascinating. And, I interviewed her once and I asked her about Twitter, and she said, I view it as almost like hieroglyphics, which is such an int like, which was funny, but is also so brilliant in a way, when she's thinking about this, because she used emojis so much, the way she thought about how she was communicating, and so it was just so very Cher.
Um, I think one other thing that your book highlights, which is interesting. Now, with social media, she has promoted certain causes, but you talk about her history with charity work. And it's more of a muted history, I feel like, in terms of she's not someone who shows off a lot of her good deeds. And there have been numerous stories about her
Hmm.
behind the scenes. Did you kind of walk away from this experience of writing this book with a new respect for her in that regard? Because that doesn't really obviously get talked about a lot.
Yeah. I knew she had done charity work because over the years I've seen, nods to it. But when I really dug in, as you said, to like, what is she actually doing? I did have a lot more respect for her. It was because what she's doing is she's walking the walk. She's not sitting here promoting herself about, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. She's putting in the work, going back to kind of what we talked about earlier, that she's never afraid to kind of dig in and be DIY and, get things done. It's the same thing with her charity work. When you think about, when she was in Mask, she became, involved with the charity for some of the people who live with the disability that the lead person in Mask did. She supported them for a very long time. She's very supporting the troops, supporting healthcare. She uses her kind of her platform and her also, her accumulated wealth and her superstardom to make a difference, but she doesn't want any attention for it, which is so funny. Which is just someone who's so vocal and someone who is so open about everything. It is a really kind of fascinating dichotomy that she's just, this is what needs to be done. And so I'm just going to do it. It's very, very interesting.
It is, and there's a lot of when you do read that chapter you wrote quite brilliantly about it, you do walk away with just a profound admiration for that. It's absolutely incredible. Our time is wearing thin, but I had one other question. Um, what is your biggest takeaway? You talked about charity and other things that you weren't as aware of. When you actually writing a book on her, what is your key takeaway of her legacy? Because
Oof.
obviously it's a lot.
Yeah.
And there was a very funny quote she had on Graham Norton a few months ago. They were asking about a movie on her life, and she said, "I think it was going to be a mini series, maybe." And she shot that down because it's like it's just too much to do. But what do you think when we're talking about sharing a retrospective 20, 30 years from now? What are the main takeaways going to be?
I mean, I think her fearlessness, when you look at her career, obviously, she started off when she was very young and she was definitely, trying to find her feet, with Sonny. But as her career has progressed, she has just thrown herself headfirst into things, and whether it's directing, acting, doing music, doing charity work, starting businesses, she is just, there's nothing that's, there's not a, there's, Cher doesn't know the meaning of imposter syndrome. Let's put it that way. She is just so fearless about what she's doing and the fact that she's just so successful. And she puts in the work. I think her work ethic as well. I think the anecdote that really stuck with me is that when she was releasing her Christmas music or Christmas album a few years ago, she was like, "Yep, I called up my vocal coach, my 97-year-old vocal coach, got to get back into shape." Who does that? I mean, like she's Cher, she's like, I haven't sang in a while. I want to make sure I'm putting my best foot forward. Like that's unbelievable. That's, artists of her caliber, granted that, you have to train, but the fact that she's still willing to put in that work, because if she's releasing something, it needs to be the best that it can be. That's unbelievable, and so that absolute work ethic. And the fact that she has so much to discover. I mean, I think I wrote as comprehensively as I could in her book but there are musical nooks and crannies that, are still a little bit obscure. She has films that she's done are so obscure. There's just so much to explore about Cher and her greatness. And I think, her legacy will always be, there's always something new to discover about her.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Annie, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with 360 about your book. Again, it's I Got You, Babe, a celebration of Cher. And thanks to everyone who has been watching today. Stay tuned to 360degreesound.com as we continue to bring you coverage on music and music related books from all angles. And I want to say again a plug for this great, great book. It's now available in retailers everywhere. Go out and get a copy. Annie, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me and for asking such great questions.